Welcome to Who Yelling Now, Season 4, Episode 13, titled Who Ordered the Silence? Copyright Mackenzie, for entertainment purposes only. There are stories that don't disappear. They are carried, not in headlines, not in books you can check out, not in records you can request, but in voices that are aging and will soon disappear. Here's a poem I call Filed Without Record. There was a story once. It had a name, a face, a place where it stood and breathed. But paper didn't hold it. Ink refused it. And time was told to step over it. So it did. Now it lives nowhere officially. No archive, no headline, no page to defend it. Just a quiet knowing in the bones of those who remember what they were told not to repeat. They say history forgets. But forgetting is soft. This was deliberate. A hand reached in, not to erase the past, but to decide which past deserves to exist. My fellow yellers, let's get to this episode's story. It's titled, The Holder of the Word. Edna was 102 years old when they admitted her to the hospital. Not because she was ready to go, but because her body had decided before she did that it's time to let go. She arrived clutching a book, not loosely, not protectively, desperately, as if letting go of it would be the same as letting go of breath. The medic tried gently at first. Ma'am, I need to see your chest. She shook her head. He tried again, firmly this time. She tightened her grip. Even at 102, her hands did not tremble around that book. She locked in tightly, like it wasn't paper she was holding, but something that could still be taken. They called for her known family member. When her granddaughter arrived, Maya, Edna's eyes changed, not softer, clearer, like she had been waiting not to be saved, but to transfer something. Slowly, reluctantly, she released the book, placed it in Maya's hands, held them there, longer than comfort allowed. Then, without warning, she took Maya's thumb and bit it, hard, sharp, enough to break skin. Maya pulled back, but Edna didn't let go. She pressed the blood onto the cover of the book, and then she said quietly, but without hesitation, "If I do not survive today, you are now the holder of the word." Maya didn't understand, not then, not when Edna closed her eyes, not when the machines changed rhythm, not even at the funeral where the book sat wrapped in a worn leather casing. It was 2 months later when Maya opened it, not out of curiosity, out of obligation, because whatever that moment was, it had not left her. The leather resisted, old, handled, preserved, but not displayed. Inside, pages, different hands, different ink, different years, but the same intention. Every entry signed, not just with names, with blood, pressed, fingerprints, hair strands bound into the spine. Some strands gray, some dark, some too small to belong to adults. There were no headlines, no dates that matched anything she recognized, no clear explanation, just accounts, fragments, repeated phrases, corrections written over corrections. Even the writers were afraid to say something the wrong way. At first, Maya thought this must exist somewhere else. Some version of this had to be recorded, documented, archived, recognized. So she started where anyone would, libraries. She searched names, nothing. She searched locations, nothing that aligned. She searched the patterns, phrases, even events that sound or felt familiar, something. She found things close, but not this, never this. So she went deeper, request access, special collections, restricted sections, archive materials not on public display. She waited weeks for approvals, sat in rooms where everything felt important, and still found nothing that held what she carried in her bag. She adjusted, changed strategy. If it wasn't recorded officially, maybe it lived in people. She tracked families, descendants, anyone connected to the names in the book. At first, doors opened. Polite curiosity, careful listening. But the moment she showed the pages, something shifted. Not denial, not confusion, recognition, and then withdrawal. Conversation shortened. Calls stopped being returned. One woman who had been speaking freely just minutes before looked at the page and said, "You shouldn't be carrying that." Not "what is that?" Not "that's not real," but "you shouldn't be carrying it." Maya began to notice patterns, not in the book, not in the world around it, requests that stalled without explanation, documents that were misfiled, appointments that were confirmed, then quietly canceled, rooms she was granted access to, but somehow the materials were always unavailable when she arrived. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it was seamless, like trying to grab hold of something that had already decided you wouldn't. She tried to verify just one entry, just one, something small, something simple, enough to say, "This is real." But every path led to the same place. Almost, close, narrowly, but never enough to hold, and that's when it changed for her. It was never about proving what was in the book. It was about understanding why nothing outside the book would hold it. At first, it was just difficult. Slow responses, delayed access, dead ends that felt inconvenient, explainable. Then it became noticeable. An email she had sent never reached the recipient, but not bounced, not rejected, just never arrived. She sent it again. This time she received a response. It stated, "I thought you decided not to follow up." This was a request she had submitted twice. Now it was marked incomplete, missing fields she knew she had filled. She completed it again. Save copies this time. Still, it returned with different sections marked missing. She started to notice things were slowly changing around her. For example, at work, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no accusations, just adjustments. A project she had been leading was reassigned, quietly, without explanation. Her access to certain files restricted, not removed, just reduced. Enough that she noticed, not enough that she could prove anything was wrong. Then came the conversations. Supervisor, casual tone. "You seem distracted lately." A colleague, "What are you working on these days?" Not curiosity, tracking. Her schedule shifts, meetings added that required her presence, but never her input. Time occupied, focus redirected. Then her position was restructured, not eliminated, not exactly reframed. Same title, less authority, less access, less time. When she asked why, the answers were clean, professional, complete, and empty. Even at home, it was quieter, but not calmer. Calls, no caller ID, no voice on the other end, just breathing, or sometimes nothing at all. Once, a voice, soft, measured, not threatening, worse than that, certain, stated, some things don't need to be carried forward. She changed her number, the call stopped, but something else didn't. That feeling that she was no longer moving freely through her own life. Every step she took towards the book cost her something outside of it. Time, access, stability. Nothing taken all at once. Never enough to raise alarm, but enough that she began to understand something her grandmother never explained. Why the book existed and why it stayed a book. Not a report, not a publication, not a claim, not a record. Contained, passed hand to hand instead of pushed into the world that would not hold it. One night, with the book open in front of her, Maya realized this wasn't about proving anything. It was about choosing how much of her life she was willing to exchange to make it visible. And for the first time, she understood her grandmother's silence was not an absence, but a decision. Maya stopped asking, did this happen? And started asking, why can't it exist anywhere but here? She still has the book, still wrapped, still marked with the blood she didn't choose to give. And she is still trying not to tell the story inside it, but to find a place that will let it live without breaking it apart. My dearest listeners, maybe they didn't stay silent because they didn't know what happened. Maybe they stayed silent because they learned what happens when you try to make it known. Today, I have a courageous guest, Miss Jenny Chan. She works in a space most people never see, not because it's hidden, but because most of us don't know where to look. She studies records, archives, fragments of history that were never meant to stand alone, and sometimes never meant to be found at all. Her work doesn't just ask what happened, it asks what didn't make it into the story and why. Because the absence of a record is not always proof that something didn't exist. Sometimes it's the only evidence that it did. Jenny is an archival researcher focused on recovering suppressed, overlooked, and fragmented history. The kinds of truth that don't disappear but don't quite survive either. Jenny, welcome to Who Yelling Now? Please introduce yourself in your own words and the work you've been doing.
Thank you so much for having me. And though that was a beautiful poem and that was wonderful. Yeah, my name's Jenny and I founded Pacific Atrocities Education 10 years ago. And the primary purpose is to find out what had happened in Asia during World War II, in between the pages, sometimes not so in between the pages. Um, and it's been a journey. It's hard to find records that have been basically classified for the last close to like 60, 70 years. And then sometimes I'm the first one to open them. And then sometimes they're already fragmented or, crumbled. And yeah, so your poem really resonated with me.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we get into the bigger picture, I want to start with something real because this isn't just about archive. It's about what happens when something is almost lost, but not quite. Um, what's one of the stories you uncovered that made you stop? Not just because of what happened, but because of how completely it was buried.
Yeah, I think one of the stories that made me really stop is post-war America occupying Japan.
Mm,
Because Japan was one of the aggressors in World War II. And but they have had really important information such as Unit 731, which was a biological lab in run by Japan in China. And it was not just like a rogue individual. They had government funding and they were doing human vivisection, which is like, dissecting humans without anesthesia.
wow.
And they were testing like biological weapons, and testing how to powderize anthrax and whatnot. And so they were doing all kinds of research from the like during the war and right afterward. There were investigators trying to locate number one where the director of Unit 731 went after the war, and he actually pretended to faked his own death.
Mm,
And so he went um and had his whole funeral and whatnot, but then officials found him with his pet monkey. And and like that really and then like within 3 years they decided to grant his whole team immunity to trade for these records of scientific studies that they have found. And then later they brought it to Fort Detrick to advance further study. And one of the justification was that they need it because they can't do this kind of research in civilization, in the civilized world. They can't do that. And that was the kind of story that struck me. I'm like, okay, no wonder I didn't learn about this in school because, we learned that America is kind of like we're a country of justice. We don't learn about that. We don't learn that we actually didn't prosecute people who were actually the bad guys, so to say.
mm.
And so that story really, really struck me.
Right. I remember, reading about the Nuremberg trials, right? And you felt at that moment like all the bad guys from World War II were taken care of. So how did you feel when you realized what you were looking at?
I felt a sense of uneasiness because there was also Tokyo trial, but none of the Unit 731 scientists were actually prosecuted in the Tokyo trial, which is like, the justice of the Far East.
Mm,
And what's also irritating to me, I felt some irritation per se, because I don't feel, because the Russians, the Soviet Union also invaded Manchuria and captured some of the scientists who
mm,
were involved in Unit 731, and eventually they had to serve their sentence in Soviet Union until 1956. But the Western media was stating that that is a communist propaganda. But then later, when I was reading that trial and then reading the records from the investigators, I realized that those two scientists who were at the Russian trial, I can't pronounce the name, I can never pronounce Russian words, Khabarov's trial.
the same here. Mhm.
Yeah, Khabarov's trial was the scientists who were there and the scientists who were at the US investigators, they were talking about the same kind of research.
Mhm.
And so they made up some kind of thing to call it a to label it communist propaganda when they were probably speaking the truth. And also, I'm not on the side of the Soviet Union either, because by
Mhm.
1974 they then had like a lab, and then they had like a series of like anthrax leak.
Right.
So that they were probably trying to use the Unit 731 research onto their own for their own gain as well. And so I feel a little bit irritated because there were people who were trying to actually maybe push for justice, but then got labeled names that they weren't, it's not true.
hmm I totally understand what you've talked about. My yellers will know I've spoken on this topic before, right? It's like, who are you, right? Are you a villain, a hero, a victim? It all depends on which labels they place on you at any time in history. So, do you believe history forgets, or is it just being actively edited? And who benefits from that editing?
And it's for political reason, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll name another example. There was a guy named Kishinobusuke who actually came up with a lot of wartime policies about how to exploit Manchuria when Japan actually occupied it. And
Mm-hmm.
at the time, by 1933, the League of Nations stated that they don't recognize Manchukuo, which is the Japan occupied Manchuria,
Mm-hmm.
and they also, but then Japan just walked out from League of Nations, and this guy, the same guy in Kishinobusuke, also signed to attack Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
And by the end of the war, he was arrested as a Class A war criminal. But then,
Mm-hmm.
because this guy was very politically smart, he actually knew how to get out of a situation. So he worked with the CIA, and promised that he can work with the CIA and the U.S. government to fight China, who were
Mm-hmm.
friends with the U.S. And Eisenhower believed him in all these things, and so he went from being the enemy of the United States and Class A war criminal to
Mm-hmm.
becoming the Prime Minister of Japan within 1 decade with the funding of the United States. So
Wow.
history is constantly being edited. People don't face justice because of political reasons.
Wow. That's a wonderful example. Um, I try to cover so many topics that speak to exactly what you said in different ways to have my listeners, have these deep thoughts on their own. Is exactly what you're listening to, what you're hearing may not be the full story. What happens to people when their truth is never officially acknowledged? What does that do to a person over time or a group of people, right? If you're in a country and you know what the truth is, but the world is telling you something else.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that even in South Korea today, this is like, in 21st century, and it's been 80 years from the war. People are still protesting every Wednesday in front of the Japanese embassy because of the scars from being colonized.
Mhm.
And they've been colonized since 1910, and it's not that Japan just ignored them. They also have like a Yasukuni shrine where they worship war criminals, and so I think it makes a group of people very angry. And I
Mhm.
will put it in also a micro example as well. My grandma was always very irritated when I was watching like Japanese anime when I was a kid. She would tell me that, oh, this is going to cause brain rot, these are not great people, blah, blah, blah. And I realized after she passed away that she has had like a whole box of military yen and whatnot that she kept. And military yen was worth nothing by the end of the war. And so that probably angered her so much when in her that every time her granddaughter watches Japanese anime, she gets angry.
Mhm.
And then for me, I thought that my grandma was just being racist
Mhm.
or demented. And
Right.
so I think it sets off people in a way because they know the truth, but then people surrounding them tell them that that is not the truth, or like you're being racist and whatnot, but then it's not speaking to their own experience of what had happened.
Right. And in some ways, this makes it comes out not just in your daily stress for those people, right? It starts becoming almost like another member of the family, right? Because you start thinking, well, I know something, everyone is doubting my mental stability, right? And in some cases, that's why some elders don't even speak. There's this growing silence within a family, because how do you convince everyone around you that actually I know the truth when your political system, your country, and the world is saying something totally different? It's almost like being in an alternate reality, huh?
Yeah, that is correct. I never even realized that that is like alternate reality. And I think I have noticed this lately that the media loves gaslighting. It's so insane. And sometimes when I watch the media version of what is happening in the real world and then I see it in real world, I'm like, I don't know if this is the reality we're living in. This is not like from my experience, this is not true. And so I think, we need to look at media as a form of entertainment and not like it's the truth.
Very, very, very good advice. I look at it with as much facts as I can find to provide myself, whether it's true or not. That's how I consume media. Have you ever felt resistance, not just to the facts, but to the idea that those facts even exist?
Yeah, actually, I was talking about comfort women on
Mm,
Instagram, and
mm,
comfort women were like Japanese slaves, sex slaves for the
mm,
Japanese
mm.
during World War II. They were basically like brutally raped every day, and so I was talking about that on Instagram, and they were like, I don't know, I hope that their robots were trolls. Just talking about like their alternative reality and how these women who were like comfort women were actually um high paid like prostitutes and whatnot. And it's very disturbing because these people are obviously living in a different set of reality, and it's like a group of them. And sometimes I feel like when there's a group of people thinking, saying something totally different and totally scripted, you
Mhm.
feel like you need to follow along without independent thinking. And for me, for a second, it felt that way. But then I decided that because I'm very stubborn, to just double down on what I was saying, that, these people were actually not viewed as human, and they were just basically there to satisfy a need. And they were even called amenities in some of the archival material that I was looking at.
Mhm.
And they were there because the Japanese soldiers were getting STDs from raping like local women whenever they invade. So then they needed to create this kind of comfort stations to so that they can have like an attending physician to attend to these women and see if they have STDs, and then so that they can keep the whole place sterilized. Actually, it didn't really stop the rape, but it was a system. To me, it felt like it legalized a whole system that shouldn't even have existed in the first place.
Very true. There is so many of those types of system as you travel the world. You'll see where this system is built around horrendous things that are done to groups of people. And one of the things that was surprising to me when I was reading about the comfort women was their reintegration into society after the war, right? It was so difficult. Their own society shunned them. Some families shunned them. So they've had to find their own way forward in many ways. And that is like a second huge injustice to these group of women. Can you speak a little on that?
Yes. So I actually interviewed one of the. I did it 10 years ago, and since then she's passed away, but she didn't talk about her experience for decades because she was ashamed of what had happened to her over the war. She became pregnant with after being brutally raped like every single day at the comfort station, and after she was pregnant, and then the war was over, and then her mom told her, hey, don't tell anyone, we're just going to stay at home and whatnot. And then she eventually gave birth at home, and then they went to like a remote area near where they live and buried the baby, and
Wow.
then just walked back home. And then they never talked about it again because they were afraid to be shunned or ostracized about her experience. And I think that is very shameful, that you don't experience just one time atrocity. It was like a repeated whole life experience. And like what you were saying earlier, that's why people stay silent. They don't even talk anymore because they can't talk about their experience. And I will also say some other example. We know this guy who was a uh, Unit 731. Like, he worked at Unit 731 as a teenager by the end of the war because they were needing people to work, and all the adult men were out fighting a war. And he was like, I would say that he's like kind of a lower class worker. He would then put people's organs into jars and whatnot for observation. And after the war, I mean, he wanted to talk, and then but then his wife and his sister and his daughter told him to stop talking because that's going to embarrass the whole family. That's going to ostracize their whole family. And I think that's a very interesting, like, it is not just the victims who were sometimes who are silent, but then sometimes who we think are the villains are were following orders, and they just they wanted to talk about it, but then they can't even talk about it because so then what is a villain and what is a victim at that point?
Very good point. It's who ordered the silence, right? And the more I think about that question, it's like, is it the government? We, the people? We, the family, right? We, the loved one. Who really orders this silence? Who orders these things to be kept quiet? Why do we not know the truth about so many stories? Good stories or bad stories, horrendous stories, stories that will shock your system. Why are some stories so deliberately hidden, and who ordered it? And the more I think about it, the more I keep saying, well, we did. We, the people. And that might be a hard pill to swallow, but it's easy to blame a system, but the system is made up of people. So if the truth is available, Jenny, why do so many people still live without it?
Because it doesn't fit the narrative.
Mhm.
The more I think about it, even though that the truth is out there, if it doesn't fit certain narrative, then it's not going to be told. So it's very hard, even though that the truth is out there, to get it pushed out.
Mm. Yes, a follow-up question is, do you have a handle on what the narrative is that we're all supposed to be following?
I get confused nowadays when I look at headlines. I don't know if you feel the same way I
You
do.
do?
One day you read the headline, we're facing a population issue. There's no
Mm.
more people to work. Then the next headline is Oracle fired 30,000 people due to AI. And that the next headline is we don't have resources to work to we don't have resources to feed so many people. And
Right,
then the next headline is AI might replace the workforce, or
right,
we
right.
need, and then the next headline might be we need more people to work.
Mhm.
So I think that's why I think your podcast is very interesting. Who yelling now? Because who's yelling the narrative the loudest?
Is the person that will be listened to. Totally understand. And maybe that's the part we don't talk about, right? Not what gets buried, but what happens when someone tries to bring it back. And the narrative just keeps them silent and keeps moving. This episode is not about what's in the book. It's about what happens when the words refuse to hold it. There are many families out there with a tale that can never be released outside of the family. It cannot be released outside of the community. So, my final question for Jenny today is, how can you turn my yellers into true truth seekers? Where should they start if they want to find out what actually happened?
I think questioning the narrative is the first step. When you see a headline, do not believe in it immediately. Look into look at the facts. And then sometimes the facts don't really line up. Then look at exactly the line of logic and what exactly don't really line up in that whole line of so-called facts.
Thank you. So I'm going to share another poem with you. This one I call The Stories That Choose. I used to think every story wanted to be told. That truth, once uncovered, will rise naturally like breath after being told, after being held too long. But I was wrong. Some stories don't rise, they shrink. They pull themselves inward, tight, quiet, unnoticeable. Not because they aren't real, but because they have learned what happens when they are seen. I have held them in paper, in ink, in hands that tremble before they sign their names. And even then they hesitate, as if being written was already too much exposure. Some stories are shy. They lower their eyes when you read them. They soften their language, bend their edges, remove details that might make them too visible. Some are ashamed. They rewrite themselves mid-sentence, cross out their own truth as if they were a mistake, leave gaps where sometime, something, someone once stood and never returned to fill them. And some are terrified, not of being forgotten, of being known, because to be known is to be named, and to be named is to be challenged, denied, reworked until they are no longer recognized, or they don't recognize themselves. So they choose not to disappear, but to stay small, to survive, while others learn a different way. They learn how to grow louder, polished, repeatable. They dress themselves in patterns people recognize. They simply soften, reshape until they're no longer questioned, only repeated. Those stories become fable, passed on, not because they're true, but because they're easy to carry. And somewhere in between are the stories that do something else entirely. They do not fight. They do not perform. They wait. Folded into pages, pressed into margins, carried in silence from one hand to the other, not asking to be told, not asking to be believed, just asking to remain intact. I want to thank Jenny for joining us today, and thank you for your time. I would love to leave an open invitation to you to come back anytime you wish. These stories need to break the silence. They need to be heard and they need to be repeated. And thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're more than welcome. Some stories, they don't end, they change hands. And maybe that's the part we don't want to admit. That truth doesn't always disappear because it's weak. Sometimes it survives quietly because it understands what happens when it tries to take up space. Because silence like this doesn't sustain itself. It maintains, Not always by one voice, but by many, by systems that redirect, by records that fragment, by people who recognize and choose not to hold. So maybe the question was never what happened, but this: who benefits from it never being fully known? And what does it cost to carry it anyway? And maybe that's what has been all along. Not an episode, a passing, because now you've heard it. Not the story itself, but what it feels like to carry something the world does not want to hold. So the question is no longer what happens, it's this: if you reach it, what will you do with it? If a story reaches you, what will you do with it? This has been Who Yelling Now? Tell a story of old and watch what unfolds. See you in the next episode. Thank you so much, Jenny.